Welcome. That was the Weepies singing Nobody Knows Me at All. And I wonder if you sometimes feel like that no one really knows you. Maybe you show up at work or at the meeting or at church as you've done today, and people say hello and perhaps they're friendly, well, at least I hope they are here. And perhaps you have a little chat about this and that, but still it feels a bit superficial. And maybe you go home again wondering whether anybody really knows you at all. If you've ever felt that, then this service is for you. The unknown you, the person who shows up and does stuff and says stuff, and chats and laughs and plays along as best they can, but still feels unheard, unseen, and yearns for the chance to tell their story, for it to be received, given time and space and respect. This service is for anyone who longs to step out from behind the mask of pleasant or not so pleasant social interaction and say, actually, this is who I am, as Kate did last week. So let's begin, as is our custom, by lighting our chalice candle. And those of you at home, if you'd like to light a candle with me, please do so. As we gather in the light of this flame once more, may we open our hearts and our minds. May we turn to this day that is yet to be written. May we be open to hearing a story that has yet to be told. And may we together write a new story, one that is rich with love and beauty and hope. May it be so. Thank you, by the way, to those of you who've made it here through the rain this morning with your bedraggled clothes, but your cheerful faces. Thank you. And well done, those of you who stayed at home today. Good move. Let's sing. Our first song is number 62 in the purple hymn books. If you have them, words will come up on the screen for those of you at home. We still are not singing actually in church, but you can follow the words and hum along and tap your feet. Any of that is fine. So let's sing. Here we have gathered.
See
So let us come into a time of prayer. Beloved, I am alone, or at least that's how it often feels. I do my best to meet the expectations, both real and imagined, of this world. I still try to make my parents proud, even though they're no longer alive. I yearn for acceptance from my family and friends, from my colleagues and my community. Hardest of all, I strive and fail to meet my own expectations of myself. And yet, I am not alone. Not really. For you are always with me, and I am eternally in you. And your expectations are only that I be myself, fully alive. And your hope is only that I will find delight in the beauty and possibility of the universe, and be kind and generous to myself and to others. You only ever want what's best for me and for this world. Help me to remember this and to live in the light of its truth. Thank you. Amen. This service is about telling our stories. And as usual, I'm going to start with a story. And this is called The Story is Sufficient. It's by Elie Wiesel from The Gates of the Forest. And this is the story. When the great Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov saw misfortune threatening the Jews, it was his custom to go into a certain part of the forest to meditate. There he would light the fire, say a special prayer, and the miracle would be accomplished and the misfortune averted. Years later, when a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, who was the celebrated Majid of Mezrich, had occasion, for the same reason, to intercede with heaven, he would go to the same place in the forest and say, Master of the universe, listen, I don't know how to light the fire, but I am still able to say the prayer. And again, the miracle would be accomplished. Still later, another rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasov, in order to save his people once more, would go into the forest and say, I don't know how to light the fire, and I don't know the prayer, but I know this place, and this must be sufficient. It was sufficient, and the miracle was accomplished. The years passed, as they do in a good story, and it fell to Rabbi Israel of Rizin to overcome misfortune this time. Sitting in his armchair with his head in his hands, he spoke to God. I am unable to light the fire. I don't know the prayer. And I can't even find the place in the forest. All I can do is tell the story. And this must be sufficient. And it was sufficient. That's the story Is Sufficient by Elie Wiesel. And I wanted to read you something from Padraig who's based near Belfast and is part of the Corrymeela community in Northern Ireland, which is a peace and reconciliation organisation. And some of you may have seen, I put a video up on our Facebook page, so you might have had a look at that. It's called Imagining Peace, but it's really about telling stories, because telling stories is one of the ways in which peace and reconciliation come about. And so I wanted to share this story he tells. It's his mother's story, really, but it's how he experienced it. So these are his words. One time, you'll have to imagine a lovely Northern Ireland accent, which I can't do for you. One time, my mother, who lived with a long and painful experience of depression, over decades really, said to me casually over a cup of tea, when I was only half tuned in, "Have I ever told you about the time the Virgin Mary appeared to me?" And I said, and I started to listen then, certainly, I said, "No, you haven't actually. I think I would have remembered that." And she said, "I was lying on the bed in the middle of the day, sleeping, during that difficult time. And I woke up because there was a strange woman in the room. She was very ordinary looking, about 70. She looked like she was dressed out of Primark, but I knew it was the Virgin Mary. And she said, I felt the depression on the bed where she sat down. And then in my mother's experience, the Virgin Mary looked at my mother and said to her, "You've never liked me very much, have you?" And my mother said, "No." And she said, "That's all right." And into the room came my little brother. And my mother looked at my little brother and then looked back again into the room, and there was nobody there. Now, did that happen? Does it matter? The Zen Buddhists have an understanding that when the wrong question is asked, you can say mu. Because sometimes to ask the wrong question is to inhibit the possibility of goodness that is present in the story. And so did that really happen? Is it true? Mu. Did it mean a whole world? Yes. Did it open up the possibility of a life and breathing that could breathe life where there had been little previously? Yes. These are the kinds of things we need for the tired spaces of our world. Words by Padraig. What a great opening to a story. Have you ever told me the time when the Virgin Mary appeared to me? I wanted to tell you a story, but I couldn't compete with that. But I will tell you one later anyway. Stories have such power in our lives, don't they? We're constantly telling them in order to make sense and meaning of the world. Our scriptures and myths, our literature and poetry, our films, dramas, songs, computer games, graphic novels, it's all storytelling in one form or another. All ways in which we try to reflect ourselves back to ourselves and share what it means to be human, what it means to be us. And we tell ourselves stories all the time too about who we are and how we are and why we are the way we are. And our monkey brains constantly busy explaining and justifying what we've said or what we've done. And some of the stories we tell ourselves are kind and forgiving, inspiring, encouraging, and sometimes not so. Sometimes they're undermining and limiting, cruel even. And sometimes we repeat them so often, we end up believing them. Often we construct narratives that conceal the truth of who we are, preferring to present versions of ourselves that seem more acceptable maybe, or more impressive perhaps. And of course we embellish our stories, sometimes heightening them for dramatic effect, sometimes editing them and softening them to make the telling and the listening more bearable. We tell stories so we remember, to honor those we've loved and lost, to give witness to the joys and the traumas that we've lived through. We tell stories in order to pass on history, our customs, our beliefs, our own life stories from one generation to the next. And so we live under these great narrative arcs about our families, our nations, their loves and their conflicts, their oppression and their liberation. We live in the shelter and the community of these stories, but we also live in their shadow. Stories shape us and define us for good and for ill. Are they true? It's the wrong question. As Padraig says, we don't tell stories as they are, we tell them as we are. So as a community of spirit, we yearn to uncover truth rather than facts. And so we aim to honor each other's real and sometimes raw experience, and to build meaningful connection and relationship, which means telling stories that reveal what's true about us, rather than stories that conceal it. And we need those stories to be heard and acknowledged. That is how we build community, beloved community. And perhaps we don't do that enough. After next week's service, I'm going to be travelling up to the Nightingale Centre in Great Hucklow, which some of you are familiar with. It's a training and retreat centre for Unitarians. And we're running a course called Ministry in the Making, which I'm part of the leadership team for. It's a training week for new ministers and student ministers. And one of the exercises we always ask the participants to do is to go on what we call a credo walk. And it's just finding someone, preferably someone you don't know or you don't know very well, and going on a walk with them, but with the invitation to share something of truth about yourself. Not opinions, but something from the heart. And sometimes we give them a question to encourage that and to provide a starting point for a conversation, which is, it's not necessarily the easiest thing to launch into with someone you don't know. So the question might be, for example, how is your heart? How is your heart? It's the kind of question that elicits a deeper kind of answer than, oh, I'm fine, thanks. It calls you into intimacy and gives you permission and encouragement to share something of your story without pretense. How is your heart? It's a disarming question, I think, and one we ought to be able to ask each other, even though perhaps we usually don't. And that's perhaps because you need sufficient space and time to be able to truly listen to the answer. But then an important part of the work of spiritual community is to make that time and that space. Padraig puts it this way. He says, we have to find ways for our stories to be imaginative enough, broad enough, spacious enough, open to the imagination, open to the possibility of creating curiosity and relationships where there are currently none. Open to the possibility of trust in the capacity to ask a good question. And when you're confused, to say, I've never met somebody like you, tell me more about you. This is what is the possibility of the imagination in storytelling, firmly rooted in the reality of now, firmly open to the wide skies of possibility that exist in human encounter and human imagination and human relationships. So I began by saying I wanted to tell you a story about myself but couldn't compete with the Virgin Mary. Well, that's a poor excuse, obviously. It isn't a competition. A good story in spiritual terms is not an entertaining anecdote. It's a revelation. It's a story that opens us up, and requires taking a risk. It's not a tale we've told 100 times before and always gets a laugh, although there's a place for that too. I'm talking about the kinds of stories where we allow our vulnerability to be seen. So here's a moment in my life in which I felt particularly vulnerable and powerless. When my mother had become depressed and confused to the extent that neighbours had found her sitting in their garden, not knowing where she was, it was clear something was wrong. In fact, she had a brain tumour, but none of us knew that. But there was another problem too, because my mother also had a history, a story, if you like. Years previously, she'd had a breakdown, she'd had various bouts of anxiety and depression, and this was on her medical records. And to be fair, she was depressed, so the GP was convinced what she needed most, all she needed really, was a holiday to cheer her up. But by the time she'd become unable to stand or walk and could no longer work out how to coordinate her feet, I was reduced to pleading with the doctor on the phone one Sunday night to do something because I couldn't cope alone. And so eventually, and very reluctantly, the GP had her admitted to hospital, but to a ward for people with serious mental illness. My mother did not have a mental illness. She had had bouts of mental illness, but this was not that. I knew that, but it was completely beyond my power to be heard. I could not convince anyone else. I suppose I seemed like a typical worried, pushy daughter, and she seemed like a typical worried, depressed housewife. We were stuck in that story. And the night I left her in that ward, she was frightened and alone. And all I could do was tearfully beg the night staff who were chatting in a side room not to forget about her. It wasn't enough, but it was the best I could do in that moment. And that story came to my mind when I was writing this service because it's so scary not to be heard. It is the stuff of nightmares, isn't it? Literally. We have those dreams where we're screaming and nobody can hear us. Have you ever had that one? Yet so many people's stories do go unheard, either because they can't or they daren't tell them. How do you ever get to tell your story if you have learning difficulties, for example? Or if you're a refugee, or you're homeless? And maybe you never get to tell your story because there's just no one willing to listen. I've no doubt you've all had experiences like mine or worse, where you have felt powerless and alone and abandoned. Of course, it's true that stories can imprison us. At the very least, they can limit us. The stories we tell about ourselves and the stories other people impose on us can do that. But when our stories from the heart are opened up and shared and allowed to breathe, they can set us free. When I tell that story, what I remember now is how much I cared about my mother, more than the failure of not being able to sort out her situation. So the telling and the listening becomes the releasing. The sharing becomes an act of love. And then the story resonates, because a true story, which I mean by that, a story from the heart, always resonates. It has a universal truth. And when we hear those stories, we can all grow and learn and form better community and relationships as a result. And that's when, yes, the story is sufficient. So let's sing again, or hum, or tap your feet. This next song is number 42 in the Purple Hymn Books. And it's called From the Light of Days Remembered, number 42.
When
thank you for your humming and your singing. Sadly, I don't get to hear the singing online, but I do get to hear the humming in the church. Next week, I will lead the service on it'll be the other side of telling our stories. It will be listening to each other's stories. How do we listen? And I'm offering chances for you to tell your stories or to start to tell your stories. So if you would be interested in sharing, it's not your life history, but a little bit of something that's true for you, either next week, the 11th, or on the 25th in 2 weeks' time, please could you have a word with me or email me or phone me or something, and I'll try to fit you in. Other opportunities will be, I'm going to do a congregational service on Wednesday, the 21st. I'll send you out an email about that, and there'll be another chance for stories there. And our Heart and Soul will be the following week on the 29th, Thursday, and that will also be on the theme of story. So trying to start to create some spaces. Of course, there's also the newsletter, and if you felt like writing something for that, I'm sure Myron would welcome receiving them. A chance to tell us something you haven't told us before, perhaps, about what makes you tick. But before that, let's just finish with a few more words from Padraig. And so he says, we need stories of belonging that move us towards each other, not from each other. We need ways of being human that open up the possibility of being alive together. We need ways of navigating our differences that deepen our curiosity, that deepen our friendship, that deepen our capacity to disagree, that deepen the argument of being alive. This is what we need. This is what will save us. Go well, and I hope you get some sunshine in your life this week.